Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be taking a look at some pretty interesting reports today, all about potential nuclear activity, and then later we're going to dive into an upcoming NASA announcement about exoplanets. It's
Hmm.
going to be a fun one.
Sounds pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it should be pretty interesting. Um, we're basing today's deep dive on a YouTube video that we found from Tyler at Secure Team.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that channel.
Oh, you know it.
Yeah, he's got some pretty wild stuff on there sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely happening. But hey, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To sort of sift through it all. So this video we're looking at, Tyler starts off talking about a mysterious event in the Arctic, and it involves this special Air Force jet being deployed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and this thing is called the WC-135 Constant Phoenix.
I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, I hadn't either. And get this, it's designed to detect radioactive isotopes in the atmosphere after a nuclear event.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're taking the possibility of, some type of nuclear event pretty seriously.
I wonder what makes this jet so special. Like, what can it do that other jets can't?
So it's all about what it can detect. It can sniff the atmosphere for specific radioactive isotopes.
Ah, so it's like a flying lab.
Exactly, like a flying nuclear detective.
Cool.
So one of the things that it looks for is iodine-131.
Oh, iodine-131, yeah.
And that's important because the presence of certain isotopes, it can tell us a lot about what kind of event actually took place, like
Yeah.
what kind of nuclear event it was.
Right, so by analyzing the type and amount of these radioactive isotopes, they can kind of get a better picture of what happened.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a fingerprint almost.
Interesting.
Yeah, so here's where it gets really interesting. Tyler reports that iodine-131 has been detected in air samples across the Arctic
Hmm.
and even parts of Europe.
Really? Wow. Well, that is definitely significant, especially considering that iodine-131 has a pretty short half-life, right? It's only 8 days.
Right? So that means that...
It suggests that there was a pretty recent release of this radioactive material.
Exactly. So where did this iodine-131 come from?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So Tyler brings up a couple of possibilities. One that he mentions is that the Fukushima power plant in Japan,
Oh, right.
which suffered that meltdown back in 2011.
Yeah.
He's saying that it might be leaking more radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean than we realize.
Okay, yeah, I remember they said they had contained the situation. But I mean, who knows, right? It's a pretty big disaster to deal with.
Yeah,
And it's an ongoing challenge, right? Like, how do you manage the aftermath of something like that?
yeah, for sure. And the other possibility that Tyler brings up is a Russian nuclear test.
A nuclear test, really?
He doesn't really go into detail about, what evidence he might have for that. I mean, it does seem like a pretty bold claim.
It does, especially in this day and age,
Yeah, for sure. But we have to remember, too, like, Tyler's a YouTuber. We have to consider, the source of this information and any potential biases he might have.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Always good to remember that.
Right. But I do think, I mean, it's still a scenario worth, these considering, especially given, the kind of current geopolitical landscape that we're living in right now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. But either way, whether it's Fukushima or something else, I mean, the fact that there's iodine-131 out there, it is a bit of a cause for concern, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because this stuff doesn't just stay put. It can travel through the air and the water and potentially affect ecosystems and, human health far away from wherever the source is.
Yeah,
It really kind of highlights how interconnected our world is.
it does. And it shows how events that happen in one part of the world can really have these, like, far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you think about, the importance of transparency and international cooperation when we're dealing with these kinds of big global issues like nuclear safety and things like that.
Couldn't agree more. We all share the same planet, after all.
Right. So what do you think? Do you think Tyler is onto something here, or is he, maybe going a little too far out there?
I think it's really tough to say at this point. We need more information, more evidence to draw any kind of really solid conclusions. But the fact that they're finding this iodine-131, I mean, it definitely raises some red flags and it warrants some further investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what develops, as we learn more. It's definitely something to keep an eye on for sure. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about something a little more, well, cosmic, I guess you could say.
Uh,
Tyler's also pretty excited about this upcoming NASA announcement, and this one is all about exoplanets.
Oh, yeah, exoplanets, the search for planets beyond our solar system. It never gets old.
I know, it's so cool. So their press release is being pretty cryptic, but they're hinting at the possibility of finding exoplanets that could actually host life.
Wow. Now that would be a huge discovery. To find a planet that could support life, I mean, that would change everything, right? Like our understanding of our place in the universe.
Right. It's pretty mind-blowing. But Tyler is a little skeptical.
Hmm.
And I got to admit, I'm a little skeptical too. He points out that NASA has done this kind of thing before. Get everyone all hyped up about some big announcement.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Like, remember that time they said they had evidence of flowing water on Mars?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And then it turned out to be like these little streaks of salt or something.
Yeah, it wasn't quite the rivers and lakes that everyone was imagining.
Right. So Tyler's worried that this exoplanet announcement might be another one of those like huge announcements that ends up being kind of a letdown.
I can see why he'd be a little hesitant. But I mean, that's kind of how science works sometimes, right? Like it's a process of discovery, and sometimes those discoveries aren't as dramatic as we might hope.
Yeah, that's true, I guess. But there's something else that Tyler's concerned about, too. He's worried that NASA might be controlling the information that gets released to the public. Like holding back the really juicy details.
That's interesting. Transparency in scientific research is so important. It allows for peer review and, other scientists can replicate the results. It's how we ensure that the information is accurate and that we're really advancing knowledge.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And if information is being withheld or manipulated for whatever reason, it can really erode public trust.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging to the scientific community as a whole.
So where do you stand on this whole exoplanet announcement? Are you feeling optimistic? Or are you leaning more towards Tyler's skepticism?
I think it's good to have a healthy dose of both. You know, it's exciting to imagine the possibility of life on other planets. But we also need to be realistic and look at the evidence with a critical eye.
Yeah, I agree. So Tyler mentions that the scientists involved in this announcement are from the Spitzer Space Telescope team. What can you tell us about that telescope?
Oh, the Spitzer. That's a really cool telescope. It observes the universe in infrared light, which means it can see things that are hidden from those visible light telescopes.
So it's like it has a special kind of vision.
Yeah, exactly. Like it can peer into the secrets of these distant worlds.
That's awesome. So how does that help with studying exoplanets?
Well, observing in infrared is really helpful because it can help us analyze the atmospheres of these exoplanets. And we can look for signs of molecules that might indicate the presence of life.
Ah, so it's like looking for those chemical fingerprints of life.
Exactly. So Spitzer's playing a really key role in this search for potentially habitable planets.
That makes a lot of sense. But going back to Tyler's skepticism about this NASA announcement, do you think there's any merit to his concerns about potential information control?
It's definitely a valid concern, I think, in any scientific field, not just space exploration. Openness and peer review are so important for good science. But at the same time, sometimes there is sensitive information that needs to be carefully reviewed before it's released to the public.
Right, I get that. It's about making sure that the information is accurate before it gets out there.
Exactly. And it helps prevent the spread of misinformation, which is so important these days.
Yeah, for sure. It's a delicate balance.
It is. It really is. It's a balance between transparency and ensuring the integrity of the information that's being shared.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is. It's a lot to think about. We've got this potential nuclear event in the Arctic that could have like global impacts. And then on top of that, we've got NASA teasing us with this possibility of finding planets that could actually support life. It's wild.
It is. And it really just underscores how important it is to stay informed. Ask questions and consider different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of different perspectives, Tyler actually mentioned in his video that he plans to post a follow-up video after NASA makes their announcement. He wants to kind of dig a little deeper into the findings and see if it all lives up to the hype.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. It's important to keep revisiting these topics as we get more information and to be open to changing our minds if the evidence warrants it.
For sure. So before we wrap things up today, what would you say is like the one big takeaway that you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is to cultivate a healthy skepticism. Question everything. Dig deeper. And don't just take things at face value. This applies to everything from potential nuclear events to these scientific discoveries to really any information that has the potential to impact our world.
That's such good advice.
Yeah.
We live in a world with so much information coming at us from all directions.
Yeah.
It can be overwhelming.
It really can. And it's more important than ever to be critical thinkers, to be discerning about the information that we consume.
Exactly. I think Tyler's approach, even if you don't necessarily agree with all his conclusions, it's a good example of this.
Yeah.
He's asking questions, connecting the dots, and encouraging people to think for themselves.
And that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive, too. We want to help our listeners be informed, engaged, and think critically about the world around them.
Well said. Well, we've covered some pretty interesting ground today. From potential nuclear activity to the search for extraterrestrial life. It's been a fun one.
It has, and I hope our conversation today has sparked some curiosity and encouraged our listeners to keep exploring these topics on their own.
I think it has. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.